In 1348, Europe stood on the edge of something it could neither see nor understand. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, did not arrive in a world of comfort or stability. It entered a continent already strained by hardship. Medieval cities were crowded and unsanitary. Waste filled the streets. Clean water was limited. Malnutrition was common, and medical knowledge was painfully limited. Life for the average person was already fragile. Into this vulnerable world came a disease that would alter the course of history. Within just a few years, between 30 and 50% of Europe's population would die. Historians estimate that somewhere between 75 and 200 million people perished across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Entire villages disappeared. Fields went unharvested. Trade slowed to a crawl. The scale of loss is difficult for us to truly grasp today. I want you to imagine what that would feel like, not as a statistic, but as a neighbor who suddenly vanishes. As a street that grows quieter each week. As church bells ringing so often they become part of the air itself. Medieval society, built on rigid hierarchies and long-standing traditions, began to tremble. Institutions that once felt permanent no longer seemed secure. In 1348, the old world did not simply suffer. It began to break. In the summer of 1348, the plague reached the shores of England. Most historical evidence points to a ship arriving from Bordeaux, carrying more than cargo. It carried infected rats and the fleas that hosted Yersinia pestis. The disease is believed to have first appeared in Melcombe Regis, in Dorset. From there, it moved with terrifying speed. Within weeks, it spread inland. By late summer, it had reached London, and by early autumn, the capital was in the grip of a full epidemic. What made the Black Death so horrifying was not only how many it killed, but how it killed. The first signs often seemed like a sudden violent illness. A high fever would take hold. Victims experienced vomiting and severe weakness. Many suffered intense chills and uncontrollable shaking as their bodies lost strength. Very quickly, painful swellings began to appear, usually in the groin, the armpits, or the neck. These swellings, known as buboes, were inflamed lymph nodes filled with pus and bacteria. Contemporary descriptions, along with modern medical understanding, tell us that these buboes could grow to the size of a hen's egg. They were extremely painful to the touch. As the infection worsened, the skin around them darkened due to internal bleeding beneath the surface. In some cases, the swellings ruptured, releasing foul fluid. The disease could also enter the bloodstream or the lungs, leading to even more rapid decline. For many, death came within just a few days of the first symptoms. Some accounts suggest that a person might feel healthy in the morning and be dead before nightfall. Without antibiotics, which would not exist for centuries, the mortality rate was devastating. Modern estimates suggest that between 72 and nearly 100% of those infected with certain forms of the plague died. I want you to pause and imagine that pace. Not months of illness, but days. Not gradual decline, but sudden collapse. In a world without modern hospitals or scientific explanations, families watched loved ones deteriorate almost overnight. There was no reliable treatment, no clear understanding of transmission, and no way to predict who would fall ill next. The speed of the disease stripped people not only of life, but of any sense of control. To understand how the Black Death overwhelmed Europe so quickly, we have to widen the lens beyond any single country. Most scholars trace the origins of the pandemic to Central Asia, within territories connected to the Mongol Empire. During the 14th century, the Mongol realm created an unusual period of relative stability across vast distances. Trade routes known collectively as the Silk Road linked East Asia to the Middle East and Europe. Goods moved efficiently across continents. Unfortunately, so did disease. The same commercial networks that carried silk, spices, and precious metals also carried infected rodents and the fleas that lived on them. Yersinia pestis did not travel by intention, but by opportunity. Caravans stopped at trading posts. Ships docked at busy ports. Warehouses stored grain that attracted rats. In a deeply interconnected medieval world, the bacterium found countless pathways westward. One episode often discussed by historians occurred during the siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading city on the Crimean Peninsula in the mid-14th century. Contemporary chronicler Gabriele de Mussi described how Mongol forces, suffering from plague within their own ranks, hurled infected corpses over the city walls. While historians debate the exact scale and impact of this act, it is widely cited as an early example of biological warfare. Whether through that event or through regular trade movement, the disease soon entered Mediterranean shipping lanes. From the Black Sea, merchant vessels sailed towards Sicily, Genoa, and Venice. These ships did not appear unusual at first glance, yet aboard them were rats carrying fleas infected with the bacterium. When ships docked, rats disembarked into crowded port cities. From there, the infection moved into urban populations and then into the countryside. Modern science confirms that fleas feeding on infected rats were the primary vectors in the most common form of the disease. When rat populations died off from infection, fleas sought new hosts, including humans. I find it striking that the very networks that symbolized medieval prosperity and connection became channels of catastrophe. Trade had bound continents together. In 1348, that connection allowed a microscopic organism to reshape history. As the death toll climbed, the fabric of society began to tear in ways that were almost unimaginable. Fear was not abstract. It lived inside homes. It sat at dinner tables. It followed people into the streets. When infection could strike within days, and death often followed just as quickly, even the closest human bonds came under strain. Contemporary accounts describe parents abandoning sick children and spouses, separating from one another in desperation. Not because love had vanished, but because terror had taken control. In some towns, authorities resorted to extreme measures. There are records suggesting that houses associated with infection were sealed or even burned in attempts to halt transmission. We should be careful not to exaggerate how common this was, but the fact that it occurred at all reveals the level of panic. When people did not understand how a disease spread, they acted on fear rather than science. Burial practices also changed dramatically. Parish cemeteries, designed for normal mortality rates, could not cope with the volume of bodies. In cities such as London, large burial grounds were established specifically for plague victims. Archaeological sites like East Smithfield show evidence of carefully organized but densely packed mass graves. These were not careless disposals. In many cases, there was still an effort to bury the dead with dignity. Yet the sheer scale forced communities to abandon familiar rituals. Imagine churchyards filled beyond capacity and carts moving through streets collecting the dead. As confusion deepened, so did the search for explanations. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for sin. Public acts of repentance and religious processions became common. At the same time, clergy members died in significant numbers because they ministered to the sick. When priests and bishops succumbed at the same rate as ordinary people, confidence in the church's protection weakened. Faith did not disappear, but certainty did. Tragically, fear also turned outward. Jewish communities across parts of Europe were falsely accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading disease. These accusations led to persecution, expulsions, and massacres. Modern historians are clear that there is no evidence supporting those claims. They were products of panic and long-standing prejudice. When people feel powerless, they often look for someone to blame. What moves me most is how quickly trust eroded. Neighbors who had shared markets and festivals began to look at one another with suspicion. The plague did not only attack the body, it attacked the bonds that held medieval society together. Medical knowledge in 1348 was rooted in ancient theories rather than scientific experimentation. Physicians were guided largely by the writings of Galen and the concept of balancing bodily humors. Disease was often believed to be caused by corrupted air or an internal imbalance, not by bacteria or parasites. Without microscopes or germ theory, people were trying to solve a biological catastrophe with limited tools and inherited assumptions. Common treatments reflected this understanding. Bloodletting was widely practiced in the belief that removing blood could restore balance to the body. Leeches were applied, or veins were opened with blades. Physicians also attempted to lance buboes, hoping to drain infection. Some patients were instructed to sit near burning herbs or carry strong-smelling substances to purify the air around them. These methods were not malicious. They were sincere attempts to help, based on the best framework available at the time. But they were ineffective against Yersinia pestis. One of the most tragic misunderstandings involved animals. In several regions, authorities ordered the killing of stray dogs and cats, believing they might spread disease. In reality, cats in particular preyed on rats, which were key hosts for the fleas that carried the bacterium. Reducing the number of these predators likely allowed rat populations to expand, indirectly worsening the spread. When I reflect on this, I do not see ignorance in a modern sense. I see a society facing an invisible enemy without the scientific foundation we rely on today. Their efforts failed not because they did nothing, but because the knowledge required to stop the plague simply did not yet exist. For centuries, many believed the Black Death killed completely at random. Contemporary observers described it as indiscriminate, striking the strong and weak alike. Yet modern science has allowed us to revisit that assumption with new tools and evidence. One of the most important sources comes from the Plague Cemetery at East Smithfield in London, a burial ground created specifically for victims in 1348 and 1349. Bioarchaeologists have carefully studied hundreds of skeletons recovered from this site. By comparing these remains with skeletons from pre-plague cemeteries, researchers have been able to examine markers of prior health. Signs of malnutrition, chronic illness, and physiological stress can often be detected in bones and teeth. What they found challenges the idea that the disease was entirely random. The evidence suggests that the Black Death was selective to a significant degree. Individuals who were already frail, including those weakened by poor nutrition or long-term disease, appear to have faced a higher risk of death. This does not mean that healthy people were safe. Many robust adults and children also died, but statistically, the plague seems to have disproportionately removed the most vulnerable members of the population. When I think about this, it adds a sobering layer to the story. The catastrophe was still immense and tragic, but it also functioned as a powerful force of natural selection. On a massive scale, the pandemic reshaped the biological profile of the surviving population. Those who endured were, on average, healthier than many who had come before them. It is a reminder that history operates not only through politics and economics, but through biology itself. When the first wave of the Black Death began to subside around 1351, Europe did not simply return to what it had been. The demographic shock was too severe. In many regions, a third or more of the population was gone. Entire households had vanished. Fields lay untended. Workshops stood quiet. The immediate experience had been horror, but the long-term consequences would reshape the social order in ways few could have predicted. The medieval economy depended heavily on labor, bound to land through feudal obligations. Peasants and serfs were tied to estates, owing work and dues to landowners in exchange for protection and access to farmland. This system had endured for centuries, but after the plague, there were simply not enough workers to sustain it in the same way. Land was plentiful, labor was scarce. That imbalance shifted power. Surviving peasants suddenly found themselves in demand. In many areas, they could negotiate for higher wages or better terms. Some left their former lords to seek improved opportunities elsewhere. Authorities in countries such as England attempted to cap wages through legislation like the Statute of Laborers, but enforcement proved difficult. Economic reality was stronger than decree. When workers are scarce, their value rises. I find this transformation deeply striking. A catastrophe that began with mass death contributed, over time, to greater mobility and improved living standards for many survivors. Research suggests that post-plague populations in parts of Europe experienced better nutrition, higher wages, and in some cases longer life expectancy than their ancestors. With fewer mouths to feed, resources were distributed differently. Meat consumption increased in certain regions. Housing conditions improved for some rural communities. This does not mean life became easy or equal. Inequality remained, and hardship persisted. Yet the rigid structure of medieval society had been shaken. The plague weakened the foundations of feudalism and opened space for gradual economic change. When I reflect on this, I see not a simple story of destruction, but one of unintended transformation. Out of loss emerged new possibilities that would, over generations, contribute to the development of more dynamic European economies. Beyond the social and economic changes, the Black Death may also have left a mark at the genetic level. In recent years, researchers have studied ancient DNA from plague victims and compared it with modern populations. Some studies suggest that certain immune system genes, particularly those connected to toll-like receptors known as TLR genes, show signs of having been shaped by the selective pressure of the pandemic. These genes play a role in how the body recognizes and responds to invading pathogens. The idea is not that the plague made people invincible, but that individuals with certain genetic variations may have been more likely to survive infection. Over time, those variations could have become more common in European populations. This fits with the broader evidence that the Black Death acted as a powerful selective event. When mortality reaches such extreme levels, it can influence the genetic profile of future generations. There has also been discussion in the scientific community about whether these historical adaptations might influence responses to modern diseases. Some researchers have explored possible links between past exposure to plague and variations in immune response to illnesses such as HIV. It is important to be careful here. These connections remain under active investigation, and science continues to refine its understanding. There is no simple or definitive claim that the Black Death directly created modern resistance to specific viruses. What moves me about this research is the reminder that 1348 is not only a distant chapter in a textbook, it may still echo within the biology of people living today. The pandemic reshaped economies and institutions, but it may also have shaped immune systems in subtle ways. History, in this sense, is not only something we remember, it is something we carry. In the end, 1348 stands as a true turning point in human history. It was a year defined by mass death, social collapse, and fear that touched every layer of society. Yet it also set in motion deep economic restructuring and long-term biological change. The Black Death did not only devastate medieval Europe, it helped shape the foundations of the modern world. For me, this story is not just about tragedy. It is about resilience and transformation under unimaginable pressure. I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you see 1348 as pure catastrophe, or as the painful beginning of change? Join the conversation in the comments. And if this journey meant something to you, subscribe to When History Broke so we can keep exploring together.